On a bus ride through Chicago, a young black student is targeted with racist remarks by a woman who believes he doesn't belong. His calm yet powerful response leaves everyone speechless, and the atmosphere shifts. What happens next might surprise you. Watch this powerful story on H2 Black Thread, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell.
Marcus Johnson had always looked forward to the ride home. After a long day of high school, filled with endless classes and teachers who always seemed to expect more than he had to give, the bus ride was his escape. He could finally let his mind wander, away from the stress of assignments, group projects, and the pressure of being a good student. The bus, the small space filled with the sounds of chatter, rumbles, and the occasional screech of the brakes, became his moment of peace. Today, however, something felt different. There was a palpable sense of unease in the air, something that Marcus couldn't quite place as he climbed aboard the bus after another exhausting day at his high school in Chicago. He was tired of the constant race against time, tired of the pressures his teachers seemed to place on him, despite the fact that he was always trying his hardest, and tired of trying to live up to the expectations of those around him, especially when it came to proving his worth. Marcus had learned early on in life that there were certain assumptions made about him just because of the color of his skin. That no matter how smart he was, how hard he worked, or how much effort he put in, people would often expect less from him. As the bus doors closed behind him with a hissing sound, Marcus walked down the aisle, looking for his usual seat near the middle of the bus. His eyes scanned the rows for any empty spots, but as always, they were either taken or occupied by someone he didn't want to sit next to. He spotted a spot just a few seats down, and without hesitation, he made his way over to it. Slipping into the seat by the window, he pulled out his phone, hoping to tune out the noise and sink into his thoughts. The familiar scent of damp fabric filled the air, mixed with a trace of cheap cologne that hung in the air like a ghost long after the person who wore it had gotten off. The smell was something Marcus had grown accustomed to, like the distant noise of kids talking in the back of the bus. He had learned to tune out the outside world, retreating into his own thoughts after the mental drain of the day. Today, though, the bus felt heavier. The air seemed thicker, almost suffocating. The usual conversations around him were distant, and for a moment, Marcus found himself wondering why he didn't feel the same sense of comfort he usually found in these brief moments of solitude. As the bus began to pull away from the curb and merge into traffic, the hum of the engine beneath them was louder than usual, vibrating against the metal of the bus. Marcus plugged his earbuds into his phone, hoping the music would drown out everything. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the chatter around him, but just as he was about to lose himself in the rhythm of the music, something pulled him back into the present. "Look at this city," a sharp, raspy voice sliced through the low hum of conversation, making Marcus pause mid-click on his phone. "I don't know what this city is turning into," the voice continued, louder now, breaking through the chatter in the back of the bus. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but its volume was enough to grab Marcus's attention. He glanced up briefly, trying to identify the source of the voice. It was coming from a woman sitting a few rows ahead. She was clutching her leather purse tightly, like it was the only thing holding her upright, her shoulders rigid as she sat with a stiff posture. Marcus didn't need to look long to know exactly who she was. Victoria Thompson. He knew her type well, the kind of person who carried themselves like they were constantly on guard, like they had the world to complain about but no one to listen. He had seen people like her before. People who had lived long enough to develop an arrogance in their opinions, believing that their discomforts and frustrations were the most important issues in the world. Marcus had seen this woman around the neighborhood before. He had noticed the way she carried herself, with an air of superiority. the way she had no patience for anyone or anything that didn't meet her standard of what was acceptable. It wasn't just the way she dressed, stiff, corporate, always dressed as though she was about to attend a high-level meeting, but also her body language. She seemed to be perpetually uncomfortable, like the world owed her something and she couldn't quite figure out what it was. As the bus rumbled forward, Marcus tried to ignore her. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his backpack and pulling his phone back out. He plugged in his earbuds, hoping the music would drown out whatever she was saying. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in another one of these uncomfortable public confrontations. He had enough to deal with in his life, and he sure didn't need some stranger on a bus to add to his stress. But the more he tried to drown her out, the harder it became. Her voice was cutting through the music, rising above the sound of the bus and the city outside. "This used to be a nice place," Victoria muttered under her breath, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her words were laced with disdain, and Marcus couldn't help but notice how her eyes flicked in his direction for just a moment before looking away again. Her gaze was quick but calculating, like she was making some silent judgment in that split second. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. He had experienced this before, being looked at like he didn't belong. He had seen that look in the eyes of teachers, store clerks, even neighbors who would turn their heads as he walked by. It was the kind of look that said, "You're not supposed to be here," even though no one had the courage to say it out loud. It was always there, lingering in the background, and Marcus was all too familiar with it. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away from Victoria. He didn't want to engage. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But just as he was about to retreat back into the comfort of his music, she spoke again. "Kids these days have no respect, coming in, taking over, acting like they own everything. Makes you wonder where they even came from," she added, her voice dripping with disdain. This time her words weren't just directed at the city or the people she thought were ruining it. They were aimed directly at Marcus. He could feel her eyes boring into him, as if he was the embodiment of everything she hated about the world around her. His fingers tightened around his phone, and for a moment he thought about just turning his music up louder, drowning it all out. But something in him wouldn't let him. Something in him, something that had been building for years, stirred inside. He could feel his pulse quicken, a deep, gnawing exhaustion settling in. He had heard it all before. People like Victoria, people who felt entitled to judge him and his presence, people who thought that because of his skin color he didn't belong. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself. His mother's voice echoed in his head, telling him to pick his battles. Some fights weren't worth it. Maybe this was one of those times. Maybe he should just keep his head down, ignore her, and let it go. But as the bus lurched forward, hitting a bump in the road, something inside him snapped. He opened his eyes and glanced back at Victoria. She wasn't finished. She turned fully toward him, her eyes narrowing with clear intent. Her next words would be the ones that pushed him past the edge. He could feel it. And then she said it. "You don't belong here. Go back to Africa." The bus went dead silent. The silence in the bus was suffocating. Victoria's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy. Marcus could feel every pair of eyes turned toward him, watching, waiting. He didn't react immediately, but the sting of her words burned in the pit of his stomach. "Go back to Africa." The words replayed over and over in his head, each repetition adding weight to the burden he was carrying. His mind raced, but he forced himself to stay still, to remain calm. Victoria's voice, sharp and angry, broke through the tension once more. "You don't belong here," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "You're an outsider. People like you are ruining this city, coming in here acting like you own the place." Her eyes were cold, piercing, directed straight at Marcus, as if she believed he was the embodiment of everything wrong with the world. Marcus felt the familiar burn of frustration rising within him. This wasn't new. He had heard similar things before: whispered comments in the hallway at school, sideways glances at the grocery store, and the subtle snubs from teachers who expected less from him because of his skin color. It was the kind of thing he had learned to ignore, to bury deep down, to pretend it didn't affect him. But today, sitting on this bus, it felt different. This wasn't just a passing comment. It was a direct attack on his very right to exist in this space, in this city, in this country. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to speak up building with every word that left her mouth. His fingers curled around the strap of his backpack, nails digging into the fabric as he tried to keep his composure. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he considered standing up, confronting her head-on, but something held him back. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a long day of school. Maybe it was the years of learning to pick his battles, to choose when to fight and when to walk away. But this time, walking away wasn't an option. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. She was waiting for him to react, to rise to the bait. She probably expected him to snap, to say something in anger that would prove her point. But Marcus wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative, not this time. "What did you just say?" Marcus's voice was calm, steady, but there was a fire burning behind it that he couldn't completely hide. It was the kind of calm that comes before a storm, the kind of calm that said he wasn't going to let this slide, no matter how much he wanted to avoid confrontation. Victoria blinked, taken aback by his response. She clearly hadn't expected him to challenge her. She probably thought he would cower, stay quiet, and let her have the last word. But that wasn't going to happen. "You heard me," she scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "This city is for people who know how to respect it, not for people like you who come in here and ruin everything." Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten, but he didn't let it show. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I just want to make sure you hear yourself," he said, his voice still calm but now carrying a sharp edge. "Because right now, I think everyone here would love to know why you think you get to decide where I belong." For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in Victoria's eyes. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She hadn't expected anyone, least of all a black teenager, to stand up to her. She wasn't used to being questioned. She wasn't used to someone challenging her assumptions. The people around them, everyone who had been quietly observing the scene, shifted slightly, some looking away awkwardly, others watching closely, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. She hesitated, her lips twisting into a thin line. It was almost as if she was trying to gather the strength to continue, to find the words that would put him back in his place. But Marcus wasn't going to give her that. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He leaned in a little closer. "You're sitting here telling me to go back to Africa like this country doesn't belong to people like me. But tell me something, where do you think you came from?" Victoria's face faltered for a second, her lips tightening as she struggled to come up with a response. Marcus pressed on, undeterred. "You think your ancestors just sprouted out of the ground right here in America? Because they didn't, just like mine didn't." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the bus was dead silent. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the people at the back, who had been laughing and joking earlier, were now quiet, watching the exchange. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. They were no longer just observers, they were participants. They were being forced to confront the truth. "My ancestors were brought here in chains," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "They weren't given a choice. But they helped build this country. Every brick, every road, every law that you take for granted, black hands helped make that happen." Victoria scoffed, shaking her head as if trying to brush away the truth. "Oh, give me a break," she muttered, dismissive. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper now. You don't get to brush it off. You don't get to act like history didn't happen just because it makes you uncomfortable. The bus was still. The tension in the air was thick, but Marcus felt a sense of relief. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was just telling the truth. And that, he knew, was more powerful than anything Victoria could throw at him. The problem isn't that I don't belong here, Marcus said, his voice softer now but still unwavering. The problem is that you don't know how to share a space that was never just yours to begin with. Victoria's face twisted in something that could have been anger or embarrassment, but whatever it was quickly replaced by a scowl. She had no words left, no comeback. She was out of her depth now, and she knew it. The silence on the bus wasn't just the result of her words hanging in the air. It was the result of her losing control of the conversation, of losing the upper hand. She opened her mouth once more, but nothing came out. She was done. There was nothing left for her to say. She had been exposed. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as everyone around them waited. The tension that had once been oppressive now felt like a collective release. It wasn't just Marcus who had been affected by her words, it was everyone around them. And now they all felt the weight of the moment. No one spoke. Not to Marcus, not to Victoria, but something had shifted, something was different. And in that quiet, Marcus knew that change, however small, had already begun. The silence stretched on, suffocating, as Marcus felt his pulse steady beneath his skin. He could feel the eyes of the entire bus on him, the weight of their attention pressing down as if the outcome of this moment depended entirely on his response. In that brief, charged silence, Marcus felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was defending a legacy, a history, and the right to exist without being constantly diminished. Victoria Thompson, sitting stiffly in her seat, glared at him as if daring him to react. Her eyes were sharp, her expression unchanged, but Marcus could see the slight flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. She hadn't expected him to stand up to her. She had expected the usual response, silence, submission, or an angry outburst, but Marcus wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of any of that. He leaned forward slightly, his shoulders squared, his voice low but steady. "What did you just say?" he asked, his tone unwavering but not shouting. He didn't need to raise his voice. He knew the weight of his words would be enough. Victoria blinked, clearly caught off guard by the calmness in his voice. She wasn't prepared for this. The discomfort in her posture was evident now. The way she had expected to belittle him with her ignorance, to push him into a corner, was no longer working. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated for a moment before she found the words again. "You heard me," she said, her voice tinged with irritation, but there was a slight falter in her tone. "This city's changing, and people like you are the reason why it's falling apart. You're coming here, acting like you own the place. It's ruining the peace. People like you don't belong here." Marcus held her gaze. He didn't let her words shake him. The old, familiar feeling of being belittled had tried to rise in him, but he suppressed it. Instead, he inhaled deeply, letting the anger simmer beneath the surface. This time, he wasn't just going to take it. He wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative of who he was or what he was entitled to. Not this time. "Why do you think I don't belong here?" Marcus asked again, his voice even but firm, demanding a real answer. He wasn't going to let her hide behind broad, ignorant generalizations. She owed him an explanation, not just a blanket statement of disdain. Victoria bristled, her face flushing with the sting of his calm confrontation. "You know what I mean," she muttered, crossing her arms defensively. "You people don't respect the neighborhood. You come in, take over, and ruin everything. This used to be a nice place, but now it's just full of people who don't care about the way things used to be." Marcus could feel the heat rising inside him now, but he stayed in control. He had heard these words before, too many times. They were the same tired, recycled arguments that people like her always used, It wasn't a question of being disrespectful. It was about how uncomfortable they were with change, how they couldn't see beyond their narrow worldview. Marcus didn't back down. He refused to let her define him or anyone like him. "You're right," he said, his voice cutting through the air, sharper now. "You're right about one thing. This place used to be something different. But it wasn't yours to begin with, was it?" Victoria narrowed her eyes at him, but Marcus wasn't done. He leaned forward a little, his posture tense with purpose. "You're sitting here acting like people like me are ruining everything. But let me ask you something. Where do you think your ancestors came from?" He didn't wait for her to respond, the words coming faster now with more conviction. "Do you think they just sprouted up out of the ground here in America? Because they didn't. And just like mine didn't either." Victoria's face flickered with surprise, her grip on her purse tightening as if she needed something to hold on to. She wasn't used to this. People like her expected to be unquestioned, their beliefs treated as facts, but Marcus wasn't about to let her continue with her version of history. "My ancestors were brought here in chains," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. "They didn't have a choice. They didn't come here seeking a better life. They were stolen, brought against their will, and forced to build this country with their blood, sweat, and tears. They helped build everything you take for granted, every brick, every road, every law. And now you're going to sit here and tell me that I don't belong here." Victoria opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to have her ignorance exposed so bluntly, so forcefully. She could see the intensity in Marcus's eyes, the strength that came from knowing his history, from understanding his worth in a world that tried to strip him of it every day. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," Marcus went on, his voice softer now but unwavering. "This country was built by people like me, and we're not going anywhere. You don't own it. You don't get to decide who has a right to be here and who doesn't." For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in Victoria's eyes. It was brief, like a shadow passing over her face, but it was there. She wasn't used to being questioned, let alone challenged. She wasn't used to being forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that Marcus was putting before her. "I don't care what you think," Marcus added, his voice steady, unyielding. "The problem isn't that I don't belong here. The problem is that you don't know how to share a space that was never just yours to begin with." The bus had gone completely silent. Every passenger, no matter where they were sitting, was now fully aware of what was happening. Marcus had no doubt that every person in the bus was listening. They were watching, observing how this moment was unfolding, how the power had shifted from Victoria's words to Marcus's quiet strength. Victoria's face twisted with frustration, but she didn't speak. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, Marcus could see the cracks in her confidence. She had nothing left to say. No rebuttal, no excuse, just silence. The tension in the bus was palpable, but Marcus didn't back down. He didn't smirk or gloat. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering, until the silence grew heavy, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Marcus hadn't just stood up for himself. He had forced everyone in that bus to reckon with the truth. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. And in that moment, something had changed. The air on the bus had grown thick with tension, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat still, his chest rising and falling slowly with measured breaths. His hands were no longer gripping his backpack, but his mind was still alive with the energy of the confrontation. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, but it was a different kind of weight now, one that came from speaking the truth, not from the constant burden of silencing himself in the face of ignorance. Across from him, Victoria Thompson remained frozen, her body stiff, her arms still crossed tightly in front of her. Her gaze had faltered, a flicker of doubt and frustration flashing in her eyes. She wasn't used to being questioned like this. She wasn't used to being forced to confront the flaws in her beliefs. For the first time in the conversation, she was the one who seemed lost for words. She was the one who didn't have the answer. At first, there was only the sound of the bus rolling down the streets, the tires humming against the asphalt. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by the thick, oppressive silence inside. But as the seconds passed, something shifted. The people around them, who had remained quietly in the background, observing but not intervening, were beginning to react. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, some of them began to move. A person near the front shifted in their seat. A woman sitting near the middle of the bus looked over, her eyes meeting Marcus's for a brief second before she looked away, almost as if she were embarrassed by the exchange. But Marcus noticed. He saw the subtle changes in their posture, the slight movements that indicated their thoughts were changing. He could feel the collective shift, the energy in the bus transforming from one of tension to something else, something quieter, but more powerful. It was the man in the construction vest who spoke first, breaking the silence with a simple, quiet statement. "He's right," he said, his voice steady but firm. The words hung in the air for a moment before they began to sink in. Victoria's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice defensive. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the man didn't back down. He simply shook his head, his eyes soft but unwavering. "I've seen enough of this," he said. "Enough of people making other folks feel like they don't belong." He looked over at Marcus, his expression briefly softening. "You've got every right to be here. Every right." The words were simple, but they had an impact. The change was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The shift was happening, and it wasn't just happening in Marcus. It was happening in the space around him, in the very air of the bus. The man's words had given the room permission to acknowledge the truth, to see the injustice that had been so boldly laid out. Slowly, other passengers began to look at Marcus with a new understanding. A teenage girl sitting near the back of the bus, who had been texting just moments before, glanced up and caught Marcus's eye. For a second their gazes locked, and then she whispered to her friend, loud enough for Marcus to hear, "I hope I never end up like that." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The implication was clear. She was acknowledging that there was a line being crossed, a line that separated the kind of ignorant hate Victoria had spewed and the kind of empathy that Marcus had just demonstrated. For the first time, it seemed like the bus was no longer just an audience to an uncomfortable situation. They were becoming part of it, engaging in the story, feeling something change in the space between them. Even the woman sitting near the front, the one who had been nervously clutching her purse, began to relax. Her shoulders, which had been tensed from the moment Victoria started speaking, slowly eased, and she let out a small breath. She didn't say anything out loud, but the way she glanced at Marcus now, with a hint of understanding in her eyes, spoke volumes. Victoria was still sitting there, her mouth slightly open, but her earlier confidence had shattered. Her shoulders sagged just a little as she processed the reactions around her. Her words, once so forceful, no longer had the same bite. The people on the bus weren't siding with her. They weren't buying into her narrative. They were speaking up, quietly but firmly, and her defense of her racist views was starting to feel weak, like an echo that no longer had the power it once did. Marcus could feel the shift happening. It wasn't dramatic, but it was profound. It wasn't about grand gestures or loud speeches. It was in the subtle change of attitude in the people around him. The quiet nods of agreement. The glances that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The subtle, shared understanding that what Victoria had said was wrong, not just in its content, but in the space it took up in the world. And the more the bus filled with this unspoken empathy, the more Victoria's words seemed to fade into the background. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She glanced around, her face growing flushed with frustration. She had expected to dominate the conversation, to get away with making someone feel less than, but now she was losing control. The world around her was no longer in agreement. The people she had relied on to stay silent, to agree with her, were now shifting. They were changing. I don't need to explain myself to you," she finally muttered, but it lacked the force it had before. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and Marcus noticed the way her eyes darted to the other passengers, as if searching for some form of validation. But it didn't come. No one offered her the support she had been expecting. Marcus didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The room was speaking for him now. The change had taken hold and the momentum was unstoppable. As the bus continued to roll along the streets, it felt like something inside Marcus had shifted too. This wasn't just about standing up to Victoria. It was about something bigger, something that had been happening silently beneath the surface for too long. A shift in awareness. A realization that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable. He looked around once more, catching the eye of the man in the construction vest, who gave him a small nod of approval. The brief, silent exchange spoke volumes. No words were necessary. They both knew what had just happened. They both knew that this moment had become something more than just a confrontation on a bus. It had become a statement, one that would resonate long after the bus ride ended. Victoria finally turned away, her face a mixture of anger and resignation. She couldn't win this fight anymore, and as the bus neared Marcus's stop, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because of what he had said, but because of what had happened in the space between them all. The shift had taken root, and nothing could undo it. The moments that followed Victoria's last, half-hearted attempt at a defense were slow and heavy, stretching like the space between the notes of a song that had ended too soon. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from one face to another, desperately looking for any sign of validation, any flicker of support. But all she received was silence. Victoria's words had been met with a wall of indifference, then quiet dissent. Her authority, her conviction, had evaporated as the weight of her ignorance collided with the truths Marcus had spoken. She had spent the entire confrontation trying to position herself as the one who knew, the one who understood, but now she was unsure, her mouth opening and closing in futile attempts to recover. Yet no one was listening anymore. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't feel the need to. His words had already done what needed to be done. The truth he'd spoken wasn't about winning an argument. It was about creating a space where everyone on the bus could hear the reality that had been silenced for too long. He stayed still, his eyes calm, his posture steady, letting the silence speak for him. He didn't need to shout or make a spectacle out of the moment. The reactions of the people around him were enough. A man sitting near the front, a construction worker with a weathered face and calloused hands, cleared his throat. His gaze flicked toward Marcus before he spoke. "He's right," the man said, his voice low but steady. "This city isn't about telling people they don't belong. We all have a part in it." The words were simple, but they carried weight. There was no debate in his tone, no hesitation. It was a statement, not an opinion. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger as she turned toward him, but the man wasn't deterred. He simply leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving Marcus. The bus remained quiet, but now there was a shift. The people who had been silent moments before were beginning to wake up, to realize that this wasn't just a fleeting argument. It wasn't just a passing insult. It was a wake-up call. Some passengers still didn't speak, but their gaze lingered a little longer on Marcus. It wasn't a look of judgment, it wasn't pity. It was recognition. Something had shifted within them, even if they couldn't articulate it. A quiet understanding had begun to spread across the bus, a collective realization that, sometimes, the most important thing you can do in the face of hatred is simply to say, "This isn't right." Victoria was growing smaller in her seat, her shoulders sagging as she processed what had happened. Her mouth opened once more, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She couldn't muster any more defense. Her earlier anger had fizzled out, leaving behind nothing but frustration and uncertainty. She turned her gaze away from Marcus, staring straight ahead, unable to face the silent judgment of the people around her. Marcus didn't wait for her to say anything more. The moment had passed and he knew it. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the atmosphere in the bus, about the shift that was now happening in the space around him. He didn't feel elated or triumphant. He simply felt calm, knowing that he had done what he needed to do. He had spoken truth to power, and now it was time to let that truth take root in the minds of those who had been witness to it. The bus slowed, signaling the approach of Marcus's stop. He grabbed his backpack and stood, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He glanced around the bus one last time, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had witnessed this exchange. Some looked away quickly, but there was a soft acknowledgement in their expressions, a sense that they had seen something meaningful. As the doors of the bus opened, Marcus stepped down onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air hitting him as he left the warmth of the bus behind. He could feel the weight of the moment lifting from his shoulders, but there was still something lingering in the air. A subtle shift. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there. He had made a small change. Maybe it would fade over time. Maybe it wouldn't. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like something had changed inside him. He had faced the ugliness of the world head-on and he had stood his ground. He had spoken truth. And as he walked away from the bus stop, he realized that, while the world hadn't changed in the immediate moment, the seeds of change had been planted. The conversations that would follow, the thoughts that would swirl in the minds of those who had witnessed the exchange, would ripple out into the world in ways that Marcus couldn't predict. It wouldn't happen overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this moment would linger in their minds. The world was a complex, often painful place, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. Silence had always been the enemy of progress. Today, he had chosen to speak up. And in doing so, he had created a space where people could really think, about racism, about injustice, and about the importance of speaking out in the face of hatred. It wasn't a victory he could claim, not in the traditional sense, but it was a victory nonetheless. And that small shift, the one that had occurred in the people around him, was more than enough to make him believe that change was possible, even if it started in small, quiet moments like this.